The wind screamed across Blizzard Peak like something alive and furious, driving snow sideways through the darkness. Each gust carried ice crystals sharp enough to draw blood from exposed skin. Etta Lane's fingers trembled not entirely from the cold as she gripped the door latch and yanked it open. The Colt single-action army felt heavy in her other hand, and the walnut grip slick with sweat despite the freezing air. The lantern behind her swung on its iron hook, throwing wild, distorted shadows across the snow-buried yard. Beyond the small circle of lamplight, the world had disappeared into a howling void of white and black. On her threshold stood a man, Lakota. She knew it immediately from the cut of his buckskin coat elk hide, she thought, with the grain still visible beneath layers of trail dust and ice, and from the two dark braids plastered against his neck by wind and wet. His coat was crusted white across the shoulders, the snow so thick it had not yet slid off despite his body heat. Ice clung to his eyebrows and the fine lines around his eyes. A small boy clung to his hip face, buried against the man's ribs, small mittened hands, clutching fistfuls of leather fringe. Behind them, both a bay horse stood with its head hanging low, steam rising from its nostrils in thick clouds, visibly favoring its right foreleg. The man's eyes met hers across the threshold. Dark eyes steady and calm despite the storm raging at his back. He did not speak. He did not beg. He simply stood there, asking nothing, offering less, waiting for her judgment. Etta's heart hammered against her ribs. She had heard the stories every homesteader between Ash River and Copper Creek had heard them. Stories of raids and burnings of savagery and scalping of white families butchered in their beds. She knew the stories were mostly lies, exaggerations spread by men like Orlando Pike to justify their land grabs. But fear had a way of settling into the bones out here on the frontier, logic be damned. But the boy was shivering so violently, his teeth clicked together like castanets. And the horse would be dead by morning if left exposed to this storm. Only for the night, Etta heard herself say. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, though her trigger finger trembled against the Colt Single-Action Army Peacemaker 1873's guard. One night, then you move on. The man inclined his head, once a single economical nod. No relief showed on his face, no gratitude, just a flicker of acknowledgement deep in those dark eyes. Somewhere far off, barely audible beneath the wind's roar, wolves yipped and howled. The storm was eating the trail behind him, erasing hoofprints, erasing the world itself. Etta lowered the Colt Single-Action Army Peacemaker 1873's hammer with a careful click and stepped aside, pressing her back against the doorframe to give him room. The man moved past her with slow, deliberate care, as though approaching a skittish horse. He smelled of wet leather pine smoke, horse sweat, and something else, sage maybe, or sweetgrass. The boy remained fastened to his side like a burr, wide eyes peeking out from beneath a wool cap that had seen better days. As the man crossed the threshold, he reached back and took the Colt Single-Action Army Peacemaker 1873 from Etta's hand. She tensed, fingers tightening reflexively, but he simply passed it back to her, grip first, their knuckles brushing in the exchange. His skin was ice cold against hers only marginally warmer. The touch lasted a heartbeat, maybe two. Then he moved toward the hearth. Etta closed the door against the storm and shot the bolt home. The sudden absence of wind made the cabin feel unnaturally quiet, the crackling fire suddenly loud in her ears. She set the Colt Single-Action Army Peacemaker 1873 on the table within easy reach and turned to study her unexpected guests. The man knelt by the hearth and gently set the boy down on the braided rug. The child stood frozen, tracking Etta's every movement with wary, exhausted eyes. His lips were blue beneath their chapped surface, his cheeks wind-burned to a raw pink. Etta crossed to the trunk at the foot of her bed and pulled out a patchwork quilt, one she had sewn herself during the long winter before Isaiah died, and the pattern a chaotic mix of calico scraps and old work shirts. She knelt before the boy and draped it over his thin shoulders, tucking it gently under his chin. He did not flinch away, but he did not relax either. Just watched her with those solemn, unblinking eyes. Behind her, she heard the soft clunk of split logs being stacked. She glanced back. The man had moved to her woodpile and was arranging the pieces beside the hearth in neat, careful rows. No wasted motion, no fumbling. Then he turned to the door, still hanging slightly ajar, wind whistling through the gap. He crossed to it and stood between the opening and Etta, his body, a deliberate barrier. The wind gusted through, lifting his braids and scattering loose snow across the floorboards. He braced the door shut with his shoulder and slid the heavy iron bolt home with a solid final thunk. The cabin fell silent, except for the muted roar of the storm outside and the soft crackle of burning pine in the hearth. Etta let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her shoulders sagged slightly, tension bleeding out in increments. The man glanced at her once, and then moved back to the boy and crouched beside him, speaking in a low melodic language she did not recognize. The boy's eyes fluttered exhaustion, winning over wariness. The man touched the child's forehead, gently checking for fever, then nodded to himself. "My name is Etta Lane," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "This is my home, my land." The man looked up. His face was angular, weathered by sun and wind, with crow's feet etched deep at the corners of his eyes. Somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed, though it was hard to tell with men who lived hard lives. "Lakota," he said. His voice was rough and low-shaped by a different tongue, each syllable carefully weighted. He gestured to the boy with one calloused hand. "Noden, my son." Etta nodded slowly. She gestured toward the cast-iron stove in the corner, where a pot of thin vegetable soup simmered. "There is soup. Not much, but it is warm." Lakota rose to his feet. "We do not take without trade." "Then we will figure the trade tomorrow," Etta replied more sharply than she intended. "Tonight you eat. The boy needs food." Lakota held her gaze for a long moment, measuring her sincerity. Then he inclined his head again. "Agreed." She ladled the soup into 2 chipped tin bowls and set them on the table. Noden climbed onto the bench, still wrapped in the quilt, and ate in silence, spooning the broth carefully to avoid spilling. Lakota ate, standing one hand on the bowl, his eyes constantly drifting to the door, the window, the shadowed corners. Always watching, always ready. Etta poured herself a cup of weak, bitter coffee from the pot on the stove and sat by the fire, the Colt Single-Action Army Peacemaker 1873 resting on her lap. Outside, the storm howled like a pack of starving wolves. When Lakota finished, he set his bowl on the table with care and moved back to the door, testing the bolt, checking the latch. Satisfied, he returned to the hearth and lowered himself cross-legged to the floor, back straight facing the door. Noden finished his soup over and crawled to his father, curling against him like a cat seeking warmth. Lakota wrapped one arm around the boy, his other hand resting on the bone handle of a knife sheathed at his belt. "You can take the bed," Etta said, gesturing to the narrow, iron-framed bed in the corner. "I will sit up." Lakota shook his head once. "I sleep here." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She recognized the look in his eyes, the look of a man who would not be moved, who needed to guard the door, who could not afford to let his guard down even for a moment. "Suit yourself," she said quietly. She banked the fire, adding a thick log that would burn slow through the night, then climbed into bed fully dressed, boots, skirt, shirtwaist, all of it. She tucked the Colt Single Action Army Peacemaker 1873 under her pillow close enough to grab in a heartbeat. She lay on her side, facing the room, and watched the man and boy by the firelight. Their shadows stretched long and still against the log walls, flickering with the flames. Sleep came slowly, if it came at all. Every creak of the cabin made her tense. Every gust of wind made her hand drift toward the pillow. But Dakota did not move, except to adjust the boy, when Noden shifted in his sleep. His breathing remained slow and steady, his posture never relaxing. Hours passed. The fire burned low. The storm raged on. Sometime deep in the night, Etta rose quietly and pulled her woolen shawl from the trunk. She crossed the room on silent feet and draped it over Noden's thin shoulders, layering it over the quilt. The boy sighed in his sleep, but did not wake. As she turned to go back to bed, she saw that Dakota's eyes were open, watching her in the dim firelight. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the corner of his mouth lifted barely just a fraction before he closed his eyes again. Etta climbed back into bed, her heart beating a little faster than before, though she could not have said why. Outside, the wolves howled, and the storm swallowed the sound. Dawn came late and gray. The wind had not stopped, but the worst of the fury had passed, leaving behind a steady, relentless snowfall that piled against the cabin walls and buried the fences entirely. By the time Etta woke, the world outside the window was a featureless expanse of white. The horizon erased the sky, and land blending into one seamless void. She sat up slowly, joints stiff from cold and tension. The smell of wood smoke filled the cabin. Dakota was at the stove, feeding kindling into the firebox, with steady, practiced hands. Noden sat at the table, still wrapped in the quilt, and her shawl, watching his father with quiet, patient eyes. Etta swung her legs out of bed and reached for her coat. "You did not have to do that." Dakota glanced at her briefly. Fire dies if no one tends it. She crossed to the water bucket by the door, intending to fetch more from the well. The bucket was full. She turned, frowning. "When did you—" "Before light," Dakota said, without looking up. Etta blinked. She had not heard him move, had not heard the door open, nothing. She looked at him with new wariness, not fear exactly, but a sharpened awareness. This man moved like a ghost when he wanted to. She pulled on her coat and stepped onto the narrow porch. The cold hit her like a fist, stealing her breath. Snow had drifted waist-high against the cabin walls, burying the steps entirely. The lean-to where she kept tools and tack sagged under the weight, but the door had been tied shut with fresh strips of rawhide, the broken latch mended with sinew and a carved wooden peg. She turned slowly. Dakota stood in the doorway, Noden peering around his legs. "Your horse?" Etta asked, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "Lame?" Dakota replied. "Ice cuts on the foreleg deep. He cannot travel. Not for days." Etta nodded slowly. "Then you cannot leave?" "No." They stood in the cold breath rising between them in pale clouds. The silence stretched, not hostile but careful, wary. Two strangers weighing the cost of trust. "I can show you how to bank the stove properly," Etta said at last, rubbing her arms against the cold. "How to ration the flour. If the storm holds, we will need to stretch everything we have. In trade," Dakota said, his tone formal, "I will haul water stake, the lean-to mend what breaks." Fair enough. They worked through the morning in a rhythm that surprised her. Dakota did not speak unless necessary, but he watched everything she did with sharp attention, learned quickly, adapted without needing to be told twice. When the stove damper stuck, he freed it with a careful twist of rawhide stripped from his pack. When a shutter hinge cracked under the weight of ice, he bound it with sinew and a thin sliver of pine. Noden stayed close to his father's side, silent and watchful. but his eyes followed Etta with growing curiosity rather than fear. Near midday, a dark shape appeared through the falling snow, laboring up the slope from the valley on long, ungainly snowshoes. Etta's hand went immediately to the Colt Single Action Army Peacemaker 1873 on her belt. Dakota moved to the window without a sound, one hand drifting to the knife at his hip. The figure raised one arm in a slow, deliberate wave, a signal, not a threat. Etta's shoulders relaxed fractionally. "William Hart, my neighbor to the south." She opened the door. William stomped onto the porch, his beard crusted with ice, his coat stiff with cold. He was a lean, weathered man in his early 40s, with the tired eyes of someone who had worked hard all his life and had little to show for it. He carried a battered leather satchel slung over one shoulder. "Etta," he said, nodding once. His gaze flicked past her to Dakota, standing in the shadows by the window, and then to Noden, sitting at the table. His expression did not change. No surprise, no judgment, just acknowledgement. "Brought your mail and news." "Come in," Etta said, stepping aside. William ducked through the door, shaking snow from his shoulders and beard. He set the satchel on the table and pulled out a thin bundle of letters tied with string. Not much. Most folks are holed up waiting out the storm. "Any word from Copper Creek?" Etta asked, untying the string with numb fingers. William's jaw tightened. "Some. None of it good." He glanced at Dakota again, weighing something, then continued. "Powerful Pete is pushing homesteaders off their creek claims. Says the railroad survey staked a siding near Coyote Springs, and Orlando Pike wants the water rights locked down tight before federal agents start nosing around." Etta's stomach clenched. How many families have been pushed out? 3 so far that I know of. 1 burned out, 2 run off at gunpoint. William paused, his voice dropping. "Etta, they came by here 2 nights ago. I heard about it in town." Etta's hand went unconsciously to her upper arm, where a bruise still throbbed beneath her sleeve, yellow-green, now fading, but not forgotten. Pete's men had shoved her hard against the doorframe, searching for contraband they never found. They said they were looking for stolen goods. "They were looking for an excuse to scare you off," William said bluntly. He looked at Dakota. "You got history with Pike's men." Dakota's face remained expressionless, but his eyes hardened. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled back the collar of his buckskin shirt, exposing his left shoulder. An old bullet wound scarred the muscle. A deep groove healed pale and puckered the kind of wound that should have killed him. "Last winter," Dakota said, his voice flat and cold, "they stampeded cattle through a Lakota camp near the Medicine Bow River. My cousin's family. They killed his wife and daughter. Took nothing, left nothing, just murder. For sport." William's face darkened. He spat into the hearth. "That sounds like Pete, and that sounds like Pike's orders." He turned back to Etta. "You be careful. Storm won't last forever, and when it breaks, they will come back." "I know," Etta said quietly. William moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at Dakota. "I respect a man who pulls his weight and does not run when things get hard. You help her, I will not stand in your way. You hurt her, I will kill you myself." Dakota met his gaze without flinching. "Understood." William nodded once and stepped out into the storm. The door closed behind him with a solid thunk. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. Etta busied herself stoking the fire, but her hands trembled slightly, betraying the fear she tried to bury. "Etta," she looked up. Dakota was watching her with that steady, unreadable gaze. "You are afraid," he said. Not a question, a statement of fact. Yes, she admitted. Good. Fear keeps you alive. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But you do not run. Where would I go? She tried to smile, but it cracked and fell apart. This land is all I have left. My husband is dead. I have no family, no money, nowhere else to turn. If I leave, I have nothing. Dakota held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and picked up a broken latch from the corner, examining it with his calloused fingers. Then we make it hold. The simple certainty in his voice steadied her more than any comfort or platitude could have. They worked through the afternoon in companionable silence. When Etta trimmed a long splinter from Dakota's palm with her sewing needle, he held his hand perfectly still, not flinching, watching her work with quiet intensity. His hand was rough and scarred, the palm thick with calluses. She worked carefully, extracting the splinter and dabbing the wound with a cloth soaked in whiskey. There, she said softly. Keep it clean. Thank you. Their eyes met for a moment, just a moment, and something passed between them. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition. The recognition of two people who understood what it meant to survive alone. Later, as they worked together to anchor loose roof poles against the wind, Etta's boot slipped on the ice-slick planks. She gasped, arms windmilling. Dakota's hand closed around her waist, steadying her with pure, effortless strength. The contact was brief, his hand broad and warm, even through the layers of wool and cotton. But her breath stuttered in her chest. When she glanced at him, he was already looking away, jaw tight, releasing her the instant she found her footing. Careful, he said quietly. I will be. That night, they shared the last of the soup and a few strips of dried venison Dakota produced from his pack. Noden fell asleep at the table, his head pillowed on his small arms. Dakota lifted him gently and settled him by the hearth, wrapping him in the quilt. You should take the bed tonight, Etta said again. You worked hard today. Dakota shook his head. He sat with his back against the door legs, stretched out knife resting on his thigh, Noden curled against his side. I sleep here, he said firmly. Etta sighed, but did not argue. She pulled her shawl from the trunk and, moving quietly, draped it over Noden's thin shoulders, layering warmth. She thought Dakota was asleep, but as she turned to go back to bed, his voice came low and rough in the darkness. Thank you, Etta Lane. She paused, her heart beating a little faster. Get some rest, Dakota. But as she lay in the dark, listening to the wind howl and the fire crackle, she knew that neither of them would truly rest. Not yet. Not while danger circled just beyond the firelight. The blizzard raged for another full day and night, trapping them inside. The world beyond the cabin ceased to exist, just endless white, endless cold, endless wind. They moved around each other in the small space, with careful efficiency, learning each other's rhythms without words. Dakota taught Noden how to braid strips of rawhide into snares, his large hands guiding the boy's small fingers with infinite patience. Etta mended torn clothing, her needle flying in quick, practiced strokes. They spoke little, but the silence between them grew more comfortable, less wary. On the second afternoon of their confinement, Dakota knelt by the cabin floor near the stove, checking the boards for rot and warping from the heat cycles. One plank had buckled slightly, lifting at the edge. He pried it up with the tip of his knife to examine the joists beneath. Something was hidden there. He froze, hand hovering over the gap. Slowly, he reached down and pulled out a small flat bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. He set it on the floor and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a narrow leather-bound ledger and a thin sheaf of folded papers, receipts, by the look of them each one signed in a bold, slanting hand. Etta, working at the table, glanced over and went pale. "What is that?" Lakota did not answer immediately. He opened the ledger, scanning the entries. The handwriting was neat, methodical. Dates, names, payments. His English was not perfect, but he had learned enough over the years to read contracts and bills of sale. And what he saw made his jaw tighten. Water diversion work. Payments to P. Pete for removals. Dates that lined up with the burned cabins William had mentioned. He looked up at Etta. "Your husband's—" She nodded slowly, her face bloodless. "Isaiah Lane. He died a year ago this spring. Fell from the Devil's Elbow trestle, they said. An accident." "You do not believe that?" "No." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I found that ledger hidden after he died. I did not understand all of it. But I knew it was dangerous. So I hid it again and tried to forget." Lakota pulled something from inside his coat, a small brass tag, tarnished and scratched, stamped with a brand mark, Orlando Pike's Cattle Company. "I took this from the wrist of the woman they killed. The one I told you about. My cousin's wife." He set the tag beside the ledger. Etta stared at them both, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Same men," Lakota said quietly. "The ledger is proof. Evidence of fraud, bribery, murder." Etta's hands began to shake. "If we keep it, Pete will come back. He will kill us. If we do not, nothing changes. More people die." Lakota's voice was calm, steady. "There is a telegraph in Copper Creek. If we can get this ledger to the telegrapher Rupert Vale, yes, he can wire a federal land agent at Medicine Bow. Bring the law. The storm will hold another day, maybe two. After that, Pete will return," Lakota finished. "So we move before he does." Etta looked at him, fear and determination warring in her eyes. "You do not have to do this. This is not your fight." "They killed my family," Lakota said simply. "It is my fight." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. We do this together." "Together," Lakota agreed. That night, as the wind screamed outside, Etta offered Lakota the bed one more time. He refused as always, and settled by the door with Noden against his chest, knife on his thigh, eyes on the shadows. But hours later, when she thought he was asleep, Etta rose silently and draped her shawl over the boy. This time, when she turned, she found Lakota's eyes open, watching her in the firelight. He did not speak, but something in his expression softened just for a moment, just enough before he closed his eyes again. Etta climbed back into bed, her heart beating faster than the cold alone could explain. Outside, the storm began to ease. The blizzard broke before dawn on the third day. The wind dropped to a steady whisper, and the snow thinned to a fine, needle-sharp mist. By first light, the world had transformed into a crystalline wasteland, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. They packed quickly. Dried meat hardtacked the ledger wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside Etta's coat against her body for warmth and safety. Lakota slung Noden onto his back, tying the boy in place with a leather sling. Noden clung without complaint, his small face solemn and determined. William Hart met them at the edge of Etta's property, mounted on his sturdy roan gelding, his Winchester Model 1873 rifle slung across his saddle. "I will ride the long way toward Lead Hill." William said, his breath steaming in the frigid air. "Make noise, draw attention. Give you time to reach Copper Creek on the ravine trail." "William, you do not have to," Etta began. "Yes, I do." William's eyes were fierce. "You midwifed my wife when she was bleeding out, and Dr. Holloway was snowed in 3 valleys over. You saved her life and my son's. I owe you more than I can ever repay." He glanced at Lakota. "Both of you. Now go, and do not waste the time I am buying you." Lakota inclined his head. "We will not." William turned his horse and kicked it into a canter, snow exploding from its hooves. Within moments, he had disappeared into the white haze. Etta, Lakota, and Noden moved through the snowdrifts in careful single file. Lakota led breaking trail with his longer stride. Etta followed close behind, and Noden rode between them on the leather tether tied to both their waists for safety. The ravine trail was treacherous, a narrow winding path carved between high walls of rock and frozen earth, barely wide enough for a horse and rider in summer now choked with snow. They moved in silence, conserving breath, conserving strength. The cold was brutal. Each breath burned in Etta's lungs, and her fingers went numb despite her gloves. Behind her, Noden whimpered once, but made no other sound. They were halfway across when the snow bridge gave way. One moment, Etta's boots were on solid ground. The next, the snow collapsed beneath her like rotten wood. She gasped, twisting, grabbing instinctively for the rope around her waist. She saw Lakota sliding toward the edge, boots scrabbling for purchase, the weight of Noden pulling him backward. Time slowed. Lakota twisted, pulled the oilcloth-wrapped ledger from inside his coat, and hurled it toward Etta in a high, arcing throw. She caught it against her chest, clutching it tight, even as the rope snapped taut around her waist with brutal force. Noden screamed a high, thin sound that cut through the air like broken glass. The boy was yanked backward, arms flailing. Lakota's fingers closed around a thick pine root jutting from the ravine wall. He hung there suspended over empty air boots, kicking, searching for a foothold. Below 30 feet down, the ravine floor was choked with jagged rocks and ice. "Noden!" Etta shouted. "Hold still, do not move." The boy froze, tears streaming down his face, but he obeyed. Etta dropped to her belly on the collapsing snow, digging her elbows and knees and spreading her weight. She pulled the Colt Single-Action Army Peacemaker 1873 from her belt and used the heavy butt to carve a handhold in the ice, then another, inching forward with agonizing slowness. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her ribs screaming with effort. Lakota climbed. Slow, methodical, one hand over the other. His boots tore through the snow and ice, cutting deep, and blood began to darken the white beneath him. But he did not stop, did not rush, just climbed, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. Etta reached the edge and grabbed his wrist with both hands. Now. She hauled backward with every ounce of strength she possessed. Lakota's other hand shot up, grabbed the edge, and he rolled onto solid ground chest, heaving, blood soaking through his moccasins. For a moment, they all just lay there, gasping, shaking. Then Etta sat up and reached for Lakota's feet. "Let me see." He did not argue. She unlaced the moccasin carefully and peeled back the blood-soaked leather. The cuts were deep, jagged, bleeding freely. She tore a long strip from the hem of her underskirt, modesty be damned, and wrapped his foot with firm, steady hands, even as her cheeks burned with cold and exertion, and something else she refused to name. Lakota watched her work, his jaw clenched against the pain, but he did not make a sound. When she finished and tied off the bandage, he flexed his toes experimentally. "Good work," he said quietly. "Can you walk?" "I will walk." She met his eyes. "You threw the ledger to me. You needed it more than I did. You could have died. So could you." He held her gaze, something fierce and unspoken burning in his eyes. "We survived together or not at all." Etta's throat tightened. She nodded, not trusting her voice. They moved on slower now, Lakota limping but relentless. Dusk came early, the light fading to a bruised purple-gray. The temperature plummeted, and with the darkness came the wolves. 3 of them appeared, first lean gray shapes moving through the timber with eerie silence. Then 2 more, then another. 7 in total, drawn by the scent of blood from Lakota's injured feet. They circled at a distance, yellow eyes glowing in the dim light, lips curled back from long white teeth. Dakota pulled Noden from his back and set the boy down behind him. "Stay close. Do not run." Edda pulled the Colt Single Action Army Peacemaker 1873 and checked the cylinder. 4 rounds left. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Dakota gathered armfuls of green pine boughs and built a small fire, feeding it with damp wood that smoked thick and acrid. The wolves hesitated, pacing, but did not retreat. He pulled burning branches from the fire and hurled them like spears. The wolves scattered, snarling, but regrouped at a safer distance. One of the larger wolves, the alpha Edda guessed, crept closer, testing their defenses. Edda raised the Colt Single Action Army Peacemaker 1873, sighted carefully, and fired. The shot cracked loud in the cold air, and the wolf yelped and bolted a bloody streak along its ribs. The pack scattered into the trees, but they did not leave. Edda could see their eyes glowing in the darkness, watching, waiting. "They will come back," Dakota said quietly, "when the fire dies. Then we keep it burning." Noden passed kindling between them, his small hands quick and sure despite his fear. Edda fed the fire while Dakota kept watch. Each touch, hands brushing as they passed, wood shoulders pressed together for warmth, was deliberate, practiced a rhythm learned without words. The wolves tested them twice more through the night. Each time Edda fired a single shot, precious ammunition spent to buy a few more minutes. Each time Dakota hurled firebrands with deadly accuracy. And each time the wolves retreated, but only just. By dawn, the pack had drifted away, following easier prey. Edda's hands shook with exhaustion. Dakota's face was gray with pain, but his eyes remained sharp, watchful. They moved on toward Copper Creek. Near midday, they crested a low ridge and saw the town spread below them, a ragged collection of wooden buildings clustered around the frozen creek, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys. Safety. Or so they hoped. But as they started down the slope, 3 riders appeared on the ridge to their right, silhouetted against the pale sky. Even from a distance, Edda recognized them: Feather Frank, Quiet Quentin, and Deaf Dan, Powerful Pete's men, all of them hard and mean as rattlesnakes. They carried Spencer 1865 carbine repeating rifles slung across their saddles. "Down!" Dakota hissed. They dropped behind a cluster of scrub pines. Edda's heart hammered. The riders spread out, scanning the snow, looking for tracks. Frank raised his rifle and fired a ranging shot that kicked up snow 10 feet to their left, testing. Dakota pulled the Sharp's 1863 carbine from beneath his coat. Edda had not even known he was carrying it, and returned fire. The heavy rifle boomed at the recoil, driving him backward. Frank's horse reared, and the outlaw cursed, fighting for control. Edda dropped beside Dakota, pulled cartridges from his belt pouch, and began reloading the Sharp's 1863 with shaking hands. "1," she whispered, sliding the cartridge home. 2, 3. Dakota fired again. Quentin's hat flew off, and the man dove from his saddle. A ricochet whined off a rock beside Edda's head and grazed her ribs, a white-hot line of pain that stole her breath. She gasped and dropped to one knee, clutching her side. Blood seeped between her fingers. Dakota grabbed her and dragged her behind a thick pine stump, pressing his mittened hand over the wound. His eyes scanned her face, quick and assessing. Through and through. He said, his voice level and calm despite the gunfire. "You will live, but it will hurt." "Already does," Edda managed. He pulled a kerchief from his pocket, her kerchief, the one she had tied around his wrist that morning, in a silent, instinctive gesture, and bound it tightly around her ribs. Tight enough to hurt, tight enough to slow the bleeding. Then, without hesitation, he turned and fired again. From somewhere below on the lower trail, a Winchester Model 1873, cracked in rapid succession, William riding hard, answering their shots. The outlaws hesitated, caught between two lines of fire. Frank shouted something, and the three men wheeled their horses and retreated into the timber. Dakota helped Etta to her feet. "Can you move?" "I can move." They ran, stumbling and limping, blood trailing behind them in the snow, toward the lights of Copper Creek. The telegraph office was a low, narrow building at the edge of town, constructed of rough-cut pine logs, chinked with mud and moss. Lamplight spilled from the frosted windows, warm and welcoming. Etta pounded on the door with her fist. Rupert Vale, open up." The door opened before she could knock again. Rupert Vale stood in the doorway, a stooped, wiry man in his 50s, with ink-stained fingers, wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose, and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Get inside," he said without preamble. "Quickly." They stumbled inside. Rupert locked the door behind them and pulled the heavy curtains shut. The office was cramped, cluttered with telegraph equipment, stacks of paper and ledgers. A pot-bellied stove glowed in the corner. "William sent word you were coming," Rupert said, already moving to stoke the fire. "Said you were in trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Dakota set Noden down gently on a bench. The boy was shaking, silent tears streaking his face, but he made no sound. Etta unwrapped the oilcloth bundle and set the ledger on Rupert's cluttered desk with a heavy thud. "We need to wire Medicine Bow," Etta said, her voice hoarse. "Get a federal land agent. This ledger is proof of fraud, bribery, arson, and murder. Orlando Pike and Powerful Pete have been running homesteaders off their land, forging deeds, killing anyone who resists." Rupert picked up the ledger with careful hands and flipped through the pages. His face darkened with each entry. "Where did you get this?" "My husband kept it, hidden under our cabin floor. I found it after he died." Rupert set the ledger down and crossed to a battered filing cabinet in the corner. He rummaged through a drawer and pulled out a folded document yellowed with age and handling. He laid it beside the ledger. "This is a duplicate of your deed," Rupert said quietly. "Water rights to Ash River. I made a copy a few months ago before it was recorded at the county office." Etta stared at the paper. It looked like her deed, her name, Isaiah's signature, the legal description of the land. But something was wrong. The ink was slightly smudged along one edge, the line marking the water boundary blurred and rewritten. Rupert unfolded a second document, older, cleaner, more official. "This is the original copy slip before the alteration. The water rights were clearly marked in your favor. But the version recorded at the county office was different. The boundary line was moved. The water rights were transferred to Orlando Pike." Etta's stomach dropped like a stone into cold water. "No, Isaiah would never." "The ledger shows a payment to Isaiah Lane on the same day," Rupert said, gently tapping a line in the ledger with one ink-stained finger. $50 and a jug of whiskey, paid by Orlando Pike." The room spun. Etta gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. "You are saying my husband sold our water rights to Pike?" "I am saying your husband accepted money to alter the deed," Rupert corrected. "But then, according to the ledger, he tried to back out, threatened to expose the fraud. And the next entry, dated 2 days later, shows a payment to P. Pete with the notation, 'Removal Devil's Elbow.'" Etta felt the blood drain from her face. "Pete killed him. That would be my guess." Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Etta could not breathe, could not think. The man she had married, the man she had buried, the man she had mourned, a traitor, a coward, a fool. She waited for judgment, waited for Dakota to turn away in disgust, to see her as tainted by association. Instead, he stepped closer and set his palm flat on the table beside hers, not touching, but close, solid, steady. "We finished this," he said quietly, his voice calm and sure. The way he said "we," as though there had never been any question, as though her husband's betrayal changed nothing about who she was, landed harder than any words of comfort could have. Etta swallowed hard and nodded. "Wire the agent. Tell him we are bringing the ledger to Medicine Bow. Physical proof." Rupert moved to the telegraph machine, his fingers flying over the keys. The machine clattered and clicked, the line crackling with static. Outside, the thunder of hoofbeats echoed through the street. Dakota crossed to the window and peered through a gap in the curtain. His jaw tightened. 7 riders. Pete is with them. Rupert's hand stilled on the telegraph key. "They know you are here." "They know." Etta checked the Colt single-action Army Peacemaker 1873. 3 rounds left. She looked at Dakota. "Is there a back door?" "Snowed shut. We go out the front or not at all." Rupert moved to a locked cabinet, pulled out a battered double-barrel shotgun, and checked the loads. "Then we make our stand here." "No," Dakota said flatly. "They will burn you out. You will die for nothing. We draw them away from the town. Give you time to finish the wire." Rupert shook his head. "You will not make it 20 feet. We will make it far enough." Outside, a voice boomed through the frozen street, loud and arrogant. "Etta Lane, bring out the book and this ends clean. No one else has to die today." Etta recognized the voice immediately. Powerful Pete, thick with cruelty and false cheer. She looked at Dakota. He met her gaze, steady and calm and certain. "Together," he said. "Together," she agreed. Rupert pressed the original deed into Etta's hand. "If you make it to Medicine Bow, give this to Deputy Marshal Titus Sloan. He is honest. One of the few." Etta folded the deed carefully and tucked it inside her coat alongside the ledger, close to her heart. She bent and kissed Noden's forehead. The boy grabbed her hand, clutching tight. "Stay here with Rupert," she whispered. "Be brave, little one. Be strong." The boy nodded, tears spilling over. Dakota and Etta moved to the door. Rupert unlocked it and stepped back, shotgun ready. 3 seconds, Dakota said softly, his hand on the door latch. "Then we run for the freight shed. Stay low. Stay behind me." Etta nodded, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Dakota counted silently, 1, 2, 3, then kicked the door open and burst into the street. Gunfire erupted from every direction. The street was chaos. Snow swirled in eddies, kicked up by panicked horses. Gunsmoke drifted like fog. Somewhere, a woman screamed. William Hart was tied to a hitching post outside the freight shed, blood streaming from a cut above his eye, his wrists bound with rope. Behind him, his hay sledge blazed flames, leaping 10 feet high, black smoke pouring into the sky. Dr. Grace Holloway. A tall, lean woman with graying hair and fierce eyes ran toward the fire with a bucket of snow, trying desperately to douse the flames before they spread to the buildings. Powerful Pete rode up behind her and backhanded her hard across the face. She fell into the snow, blood streaming from her split lip, the bucket spinning away. Rage flooded through Etta like fire. She raised the Colt single-action Army Peacemaker 1873 and fired. The shot went wide, punching through the wall of the freight shed. But Pete's horse shied and reared, forcing him to fight for control. Dakota grabbed Noden, who had bolted from the telegraph office in terror, and sprinted for the freight shed, dodging through the chaos. Bullets kicked up snow around his feet. He dove through the door and disappeared inside. Across the street, Etta grabbed Rupert, who had stumbled out after them. Clutching his bleeding arm, a bullet had torn through the meat above his elbow, blood soaking his sleeve in a widening stain. She dragged him back toward the telegraph office. but Pete's men were closing in, cutting off their escape. From inside the freight shed, Lakota shouted, "Etta, the hatchback of the building." She understood instantly. She hauled Rupert around the corner and circled to the back of the shed, searching frantically. There, a narrow storm drain, half choked with ice, barely visible beneath the snow. She dropped to her knees and tore at the ice with her bare hands, nails-splitting fingers going numb. From inside the shed, she heard the crackle of flames. Pete's men had torched it. A small body wriggled through the drain, Noden coughing, gasping, sobbing. Etta grabbed him and pulled him out, crushing him to her chest. "I have you. I have you." Then Lakota came belly-sliding through the narrow culvert, his broad shoulders barely fitting face, black with soot eyes streaming from the smoke. He burst onto the creek bank, coughing hard, and Etta grabbed his arm and hauled him to his feet. "Run!" she shouted. They ran, stumbling over broken ice, the ledger, and Deed clutched tight inside Etta's coat, Noden clinging to Lakota's back. Behind them, the freight shed collapsed in a roar of flame and falling timber sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. Pete and his men mounted and gave chase, their horses' hooves drumming thunder on the frozen ground. The Devil's Elbow trestle loomed ahead, a skeletal structure of timber and iron, spanning the Medicine Bow River. The trestle was old-built decades earlier for a logging operation that had long since failed, the wood weathered silver gray and creaking under its own weight. Below the river, ground ice flows together with a sound like distant thunder, crushing and grinding, relentless and deadly. Etta, Lakota, and Noden scrambled onto the trestle boots, slipping on frozen planks slick with ice. The structure groaned under their weight. Behind them, Pete's crew closed the distance rifles, cracking bullets, whining through the latticework of beams. William Hart appeared from the depot. His hands freed, his face bloody but determined. He raised his Winchester Model 1873 and fired in rapid succession, forcing the riders to scatter and take cover. Dr. Grace Holloway grabbed a bucket and hurled it, lantern and all, at Feather Frank's horse. The animal reared screaming, and Frank tumbled from the saddle cursing. But Pete dismounted calmly, deliberately, and advanced on foot. His men fanned out behind him, moving with the practiced ease of killers. Pete's face split in a wide, cruel grin. Lakota pushed Etta behind a thick wooden brace, shielding her body with his. A bullet splintered the timber beside his head, and a long, jagged splinter drove through his left forearm like a lance. He hissed, jaw-clenching, but did not move. Etta's breath came in short, desperate gasps. She could see Pete clearly now, a massive man with a salt and pepper beard, cold blue eyes, and hands the size of dinner plates. "Your man sold you for $50 and a jug of rot-gut whiskey," Pete shouted, his voice carrying across the trestle. "Signed your deed away like it was nothing, then got cold feet and threatened to talk. So I gave him a little push, right off this very trestle." He laughed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. "You want to join him, Widow Lane?" Rage and grief and something wild surged through Etta's chest. She felt something break inside her, not despair, but fury. Pete raised his Spencer 1865 carbine rifle sighting carefully at Lakota's chest. Lakota stepped between Etta and the barrel. The motion was deliberate, protective, instinctive. Every mile they had traveled together, every moment of trust and shared survival crystallized in that single movement. Etta did not freeze. She used the second he bought her. She slid along the brace low and fast and stood. She raised the Colt single-action Army Peacemaker 1873, sighted and fired. The bullet shattered Pete's right hand and the shooting hand. He howled, the Spencer 1865 carbine tumbling from his ruined fingers, spinning down through the trestle lattice and into the roaring river below. Feather Frank lunged at Lakota with a skinning knife blade flashing. Lakota pivoted, hip-checked Frank hard, and sent him stumbling sideways into a gap between the planks. Frank grabbed a beam with both hands, legs dangling over empty air, screaming. Dakota kicked the knife away, watching it spin into the abyss, then turned and hauled Etta toward the far end of the trestle, where a rusted handcar sat on the rails. Before they pumped the handcar, Dakota kicked frozen sleet from the railhead, and Etta scattered sand from a burlap sack. Only then did the wheels bite on the iron. William cranked the handcar's lever with desperate strength, while Dakota and Etta loaded Noden and the ledger onto the platform. Bullets pinged off the iron frame, sparking. The handcar lurched forward, wheels screeching over gaps where planks had rotted away. The whole structure shuddered. Etta looked back once. Dr. Grace and a cluster of townsmen, storekeepers, miners, farmers, people who had been too afraid to act until now, advanced on Pete's scattered, demoralized crew rifles, raised faces grim. The blizzard returned with sudden, brutal force, white curtains of snow swallowing the trestle, the town, and the world. Dakota wrapped his body around Etta in the lee of the handcar, sharing warmth. No hesitation, no awkwardness, just survival, and something deeper. She pressed against him, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong. They pumped the handcar through the storm hands, blistering, breath-ragged muscles screaming. By dawn, they reached Medicine Bow. U.S. Deputy Marshal Titus Sloan was a square-jawed man in his early 40s, with iron-gray hair, a thick mustache, and eyes like flint. He wore a long duster and a worn Stetson, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had seen too much and believed in justice anyway. He read the ledger with meticulous care, compared the original deed Rupert had saved, and swore out warrants for Orlando Pike, Powerful Pete, and every man named in the ledger. Fraud, bribery, arson, assault, and murder. Sloan said grimly, his voice flat and cold. I will bring them in, every last one. He assembled a posse of 8 men, hard men, good men, men who believed in law even when law was scarce, and rode back toward Copper Creek with the warrants in his saddlebag. Dr. Grace Holloway arrived in Medicine Bow the next day and set up a temporary infirmary in the freight room of the depot. She tended Dakota's forearm with brisk, practiced efficiency, cleaning the wound, extracting splinters, stitching with neat, tight stitches. She bandaged Etta's ribs, tisking at the torn flesh, her bruised jaw a silent testament to her own courage. Etta helped lace Dakota's arm, splinter hands shaking for the first time now that the adrenaline was draining away, leaving only exhaustion and pain. You could have left us at the culvert, she said quietly, not looking at him. Saved yourself. No one would have blamed you. Dakota met her eyes. That is not how I live. She nodded, throat tight with emotion she could not name. Noden slept on a grain sack in the corner, wrapped in blankets, his small face peaceful at last. 2 weeks later, Marshal Sloan returned. Pete's crew had scattered like rats when the posse arrived, most fleeing into the mountains, a few surrendering without a fight. Powerful Pete himself, his hand ruined and infection setting in, had been cornered at Coyote Springs and brought in shackled and fever-mad. Orlando Pike, faced with the ledger, Rupert's deed copy, and the testimony of William Hart, Dr. Grace Holloway, and half a dozen townspeople, confessed to everything. Isaiah Lane had indeed altered Etta's deed in exchange for $50 and whiskey. When Isaiah developed a conscience and threatened to expose the fraud, Pete had arranged his accident at Devil's Elbow. The confession was recorded, witnessed, and signed. At the preliminary hearing held in the Medicine Bow courthouse, an unexpected detail emerged. William Hart's name appeared in the ledger as well. Years earlier, during a desperate winter, William had worked briefly for Pike, rounding up wild mustangs for sale. The association was legal, but the paper trail implicated him by proximity. William's cattle were seized as material evidence pending investigation. He would be broke for months, maybe longer. When Etta visited him at the boarding house where he was staying during the inquiry, he shrugged, tired but unbroken. Better to be broke and honest than rich and crooked. He said simply, I have a plow horse you can use come spring, Etta offered. William's weathered face softened. I will take you up on that, Etta. And thank you. Rupert Vale recovered from his wound and returned to Copper Creek. He kept a framed copy of one page from the ledger on the wall behind his telegraph desk, a reminder, he said, of what truth cost and what it could win. Dr. Grace Halloway stayed in Copper Creek and opened a small clinic above the general store. The thin white scar on her lip from Pete's blow remained, but she wore it without shame, a badge of courage. One detail from the ledger surprised Etta more than anything else. Among the payments and bribes and blood money, there were monthly entries labeled Widow's Relief Fund. Rupert traced the payments through the unsent receipts and discovered they had gone to Sapphire Springs School, supporting 2 orphaned girls' daughters of a minor Isaiah had accidentally injured in a claim dispute years before. Etta read the entries alone in her rented room, tears streaming down her face. Isaiah Lane had been a coward, a fool, a betrayer. But he had not been purely a monster. He had tried in his own broken way to atone. Truth is the only ground we can plant in, she whispered to the empty room, closing the ledger for the last time. She would not open it again. In late winter, when the snow began to melt and the first green shoots pushed through the mud, Dakota and Noden returned to Ash River. Etta stood on her cabin porch, watching them ride up the trail on Dakota's now-healed bay horse, and felt something settle deep in her chest, something she had not felt in years. Something like hope. They worked together to raise a new barbed wire fence along the reaffirmed water boundary. The work was cold, hard, honest. William joined them when the investigation cleared him, bringing the plow horse Etta had promised. One afternoon, as they stretched wire between posts, a barb bit deep into Etta's palm. She gasped, dropping the pliers. Dakota was beside her in an instant, taking her hand in his without a word. He wrapped the wound in clean muslin from his pack, his touch careful, practiced, gentle. She did not pull away. That night, a sudden wind squall slammed the shed door with a bang that made everyone jump. Dakota's arm moved instinctively to shield Etta. She did not step away. Their eyes met and held. Later, by the hearth, Dakota laid out his bedroll on the floor as he always did. But Etta brought out a second quilt and placed it beside Noden. She looked at Dakota, her heart beating hard. "You are staying through the thaw," she said. It was not a question. Dakota held her gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, something built not on words or promises, but on survival trust and shared hardship. "Yes," he said simply. Noden looked up at them both and smiled, a rare, bright thing. Spring came slowly to Blizzard Peak, but it came. The fences stood straight and strong. The creek ran clear and cold. The cabin held against wind and weather. One morning in early April, Etta woke to the sound of hammering. She stepped onto the porch and saw Dakota and William raising a new support beam for the expanded lean-to. Noden handed them nails one by one, his small face serious with concentration, mimicking his father's careful precision. Dr. Grace Halloway rode up on her sturdy mare saddlebags, bulging with medical supplies. "Thought you might need an extra pair of hands," she said with a smile. They worked together through the warm morning, 4 adults and 1 boy raising walls, mending what winter had broken, building something new. At midday, they sat on the porch steps and shared a meal of cornbread beans and fresh butter from William's recovered cow. The sun was warm, the sky a pale, endless blue, the air smelling of pine and wet earth and new beginnings. "What will you do now?" Dr. Grace asked Dakota, genuine curiosity in her voice. He glanced at Etta, then at Noden, then back at the half-built lean-to. "Stay. Work. Build." "That is a good answer," Dr. Grace said warmly. William raised his tin cup of weak coffee. To truth, and to the stubborn fools who dig it up and hold it to the light. They drank together, laughing. That evening, as the sun set behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and deep violet, Lakota and Noden carried a section of new fence line through, under territorial statute for fraud and conspiracy to deprive settlers of title. The court entered judgment against Orlando Pike. Papers were filed at Medicine Bow, and the marshal's levy attached his cattle and rolling stock. Eeg the soft light. The boy walked between them, holding a coil of wire, and when he stumbled over a hidden root, both adults reached for him at the same instant. Their hands met over the boy's shoulder. Lakota's calloused fingers brushed Eda's work-worn knuckles. Neither pulled away. They walked on together, three figures silhouetted against the wide open sky, the fence line stretching behind them like a promise. Summer came green and generous. The crops grew tall. The water flowed where it should. The land healed. Eda and Lakota worked side by side, day after day, building a life neither had dared imagine, but both had earned through blood and fire and stubborn will. Noden grew taller, his laughter ringing through the valley. He learned to ride bareback, to plant seeds in straight rows, to mend harness with rawhide and patience. He learned English from Eda and taught her words in Lakota, a slow, careful exchange that built bridges between worlds. He called her Eda Never Mother, but the way he looked at her, shy, hopeful, trusting, said more than any title ever could. One evening in late summer, as they stood on the hill overlooking the homestead, watching the light fade over the mountains, Lakota spoke quietly. "I did not think I would find a place to stay," he said. "After everything we lost, after all the death, I thought we would wander forever." "Neither did I," Eda replied, her voice soft. "I thought this place would bury me like it buried Isaiah. I thought I would die here alone." They stood in silence, the wind whispering through the grass. "Eda," Lakota said, and there was something in his voice that made her turn to face him fully. "I will not leave, not unless you ask me to." She looked at him, this quiet, fierce man who had walked into her life out of a blizzard and stayed when any sane person would have run. This man who had risked everything for a stranger's justice, who had shielded her body with his own, who had taught his son to trust again. "I do not want you to leave," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I want you to stay, both of you, for as long as you will." The corner of Lakota's mouth lifted a small, rare smile that transformed his whole face. "Then we stay." That night, they sat by the fire, as they always did. But when Lakota laid out his bedroll, Eda did not go to the bed. She sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, and they watched the flames dance together in comfortable silence. No vows were spoken, no formal promises made. But when Noden woke in the deep hours of the night and found them both there sitting together, he smiled and went peacefully back to sleep, secure in a way he had not been since his mother died. The years passed marked by the turning of seasons and the slow, steady work of living. The homestead grew. A new barn rose beside the cabin. Fields of wheat and barley rippled gold in the summer wind. A small herd of cattle grazed the hills. William brought his wife and young son to visit often, and they sat on the expanded porch and told stories until the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Dr. Grace Holloway delivered Eda and Lakota's first child together, a daughter with Eda's red hair and Lakota's dark, serious eyes, who came into the world screaming loud enough to wake the valley, and did not stop until her father held her against his chest and sang softly in Lakota. Noden grew into a strong, steady young man who could ride and shoot and build as well as anyone in the valley. He never forgot the night his father brought him to a stranger's cabin in a storm, or the red-haired woman who opened her door and gave them shelter when the world was frozen and cruel. Rupert Vale retired and moved to Medicine Bow, where he spent his days writing long, thoughtful letters to newspapers about justice and truth. Every Christmas, he sent a letter to Etta and Lakota, each one ending with the same phrase, "Truth endures, and so do good people." Powerful Pete died in prison 2 years after his conviction infection, finally claiming the hand Etta had shattered. Orlando Pike served 10 years of hard labor and was released a broken, shrunken man. He died alone in a Cheyenne boarding house, unmourned and unremembered his fortune, and power scattered like dust. The ledger was filed in the Federal Archives in Washington, a footnote in the long, bloody history of frontier land fraud and the slow march of justice. But for the people who had lived it, who had bled for it, fought for it, risked everything for it, the ledger was far more than paper and ink. It was the line between right and wrong, the weight of truth, the cost of integrity. And it was the reason a Lakota warrior and a red-haired widow built a life together on the ragged edge of the world, where the snow fell hard and the land demanded everything, but gave back just enough to those brave enough to stay and stubborn enough to hope. On a bright autumn day, many years later, Etta stood on the porch of the expanded cabin and watched Lakota and a grown Noden repair the far fence line. Her daughter, now 10, fierce and curious, played in the yard chasing the chickens and laughing at their indignant squawks. Lakota looked up, as he so often did, and caught her eye across the distance. He smiled, still rare, still small, but real and warm, and meant only for her. She smiled back, her heart full. The wind whispered through the valley, carrying the scent of pine and sage and home. In that moment, Etta Lane knew with a bone-deep certainty that she had found what she had been searching for all her life, even when she had not known she was searching. Not safety, though they had built that together. Not wealth, though they had enough. Not even love, in the wild, romantic way the storybooks told it. But something better, something rarer, partnership, trust, a place to stand, a reason to stay. And in the end, that was more than enough. It was everything.